Hi, this is Randal, host of FLOSS Weekly. This week, Simon Phipps joins me. We're going to be talking about Hyperledger, a way to use the blockchain for public records. You're not going to want to miss this, so stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for FLOSS Weekly is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is FLOSS Weekly with Randal Schwartz and Simon Phipps. Episode 442, recorded July 19th, 2017. Hyperledger. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by the Amazon Aurora from AWS, a relational database engine that's compatible with MySQL and PostgreSQL, which provides up to 5 times the performance on the same hardware at 1/10 of the cost. Check it out at aurora.aws. It's time for FLOSS Weekly, the show about free, libre, open source software. I am your host, Randal Schwartz, Merlin at Stonehenge.com, bringing you each week the movers, the shakers, the big projects, the little projects, projects you may be using every day and totally unaware of it, projects you might want to download and play with right after this show. Joining me once again is my lovely and talented co-host, Simon Phipps. Simon, welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Randal. It's very lovely to be back with you again after so long. It's been like a month and a half since I've been on the shows. It's great.
Yeah, I know you don't call, you don't write. I have no idea what's going on in your life. It's still pretty crazy. I'm just kidding, actually. I know pretty much everything that you tell us anyway. Let's put it that way.
The NSA has told you everything that's going on in my life, I'm sure.
I don't have an NSA connection, or at least that's what they tell me to say. Okay.
Yeah, you just have a file, I know.
So I'm once again in the same place I was last week. I am in beautiful downtown Santa Monica at the 11th floor headquarters of ZipRecruiter. And although I'm still in the crazy conference room where you can't actually see behind me and see the wonderful skyline, I will be there for the taping of the show in about 3 weeks. So I finally got to book that other cool room again. I forgot that I hadn't done that yet. Anyway, and where are you speaking to us from, Simon?
I am here in my back cave in Southampton in the United Kingdom, where I've been dealing with torrential rain for the last couple of days. And I have all sorts of things going on. You can see the wonderful ordered mess of my office behind if you are watching on video.
Well, I have been really looking forward to this particular show. I always look forward to all my shows because I have some incredible guests over the 10 years we've been doing the show. But this particular show brings up a great subject, a subject that's very modern and very essential now to the as we go forward doing more and more business on the web, and that's basically blockchains. In particular, blockchains are used, you might be more familiar with it in terms of this thing called Bitcoin, where you can exchange money in a protected way that uses proof of work to figure out how to move a ledger forward. But blockchains, we've actually had blockchains a number of times on FLOSS Weekly already. About 3 years ago, we had Bitcore on, and then we had Augur, which is about proof of things based on Bitcoin. We had Bitcore 2.0 came back. Actually, you did that show, I think, Simon, didn't you?
I think I did both of the Bitcore shows, in actual fact. Yeah.
Okay. And then also Lisk, which is another blockchain technology. And I wonder where all these things went. I actually didn't bother researching if they're still around or not. But hopefully today sticks around for quite a bit. It's this project called Hyperledger. Well, actually, Hyperledger is an umbrella of projects all related to blockchain technology. The Hyperledger project is led by none other than Brian Behlendorf, who's been around, I hope I didn't mispronounce his name just now, has been around for a very long time. He actually is one of the original authors of Apache, which most of you are probably using somewhere or another if you're in the open source world. That's probably like the number 1 or number 2 web server out there now. But he's the executive director of the Hyperledger umbrella project, and we're going to get in today to why you would want blockchain. And what's funny is none of this is about coins. This is completely moved on beyond coins. It's about having public ledgers, records of work, things like that. So I don't understand it all, but that's a good reason to bring a guest on to talk about things like that. Simon, why don't you fill us in a little bit too?
Yeah, so back in 2011, I wrote an article about Bitcoin. And so I've been following the subject ever since as a result of a happy accident of people donating Bitcoins to me back when I wrote the article. So I have an interest in those. And then looking into the technology behind it, the technology is a very useful tool for solving all sorts of problems where you want to have a distributed system rather than a hierarchical authority system. And I think a lot of organizations had been looking at using Bitcoin and were a bit put off by the gold rush speculation around the coins. And out of that grew a desire to have blockchain, but without all of the cryptocurrency gold rush. And that's how I see Hyperledger. Hyperledger is the corporate answer to using blockchain for distributed solutions without having to get into cryptocurrency. But I'm sure Brian's going to tell us some more about that.
Absolutely, he will, but in just a moment, because first, I have to say, this episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by the Amazon Aurora from Amazon Web Services. To build the kinds of things that developers want to build today, they need better tools, super tools, like a database that will grow as your business grows and is easy to manage. That's why AWS built Amazon Aurora, a relational database engine that's compatible with MySQL and PostgreSQL and provides up to 5 times the performance of standard MySQL on the same hardware. The Amazon Aurora can scale up to millions of transactions per minute, can automatically grow your storage up to 64 terabytes if need be, can replicate 6 copies of your data to 3 different availability zones, and can tolerate failures and even automatically fix them, and it continually backs up your data to Amazon S3. And Amazon RDS fully manages it all, so you don't have to. If you're already using Amazon RDS for MySQL, you can migrate to Amazon Aurora with just a few clicks. So what you're getting is up to 5 times better performance with MySQL with the security, availability, and reliability of a commercial database, all at a tenth of the cost. No upfront charges, no commitments, and you only pay for what you use. Check out aurora.aws and start imagining what you can build with Amazon Aurora from AWS. That's AURORA.AWS. And we thank them for their support of Floss Weekly. And let's go ahead and bring in our guest. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. How are you?
I'm doing well. And where are you speaking to us from, besides a library, maybe?
Calling from my home office in San Francisco, where we, as compared to Simon's, we don't have torrential rain, but we do have torrential fog in the summertime. And so it's a soft muted light in the background. But yeah, you can see a fraction of my CD collection in the background.
Oh, those are CDs. I thought they were books, but I was thinking it would be odd to have them all exactly the same size books. That would be very, very odd. Very odd.
So, I guess I could be an anime fan, but yeah.
There you go. Very good. Very good. Well, so Simon and I gave hopefully a fairly good description of what blockchain is all about. But why don't you give us a 30,000-foot view? What problem am I solving by reaching for blockchain?
So those of us who've been on the internet since, I'm presuming, Randal and Simon, you both got on kind of early 90s, mid-90s maybe?
Back in the early days.
Yeah, well, I mean, it goes back even further, right?
Yes.
And you remember things like, deploying protocols like SMTP and HTTP and other things that let you put a printing press on, your desktop computer, essentially. And I mean, I launched the first version of Wired magazine, Wired public website, where my desktop was actually the public-facing website, right? And that's not something anybody would do today. That'd be kind of crazy. But there was something to that decentralized nature of the net. We even think about things like Usenet, right, which was kind of the original social network, and it was fairly entirely decentralized, both to good effect, and later that meant it was really hard to fight spam and other kind of DDoS kinds of issues. But Usenet still thrives in kind of the backwaters of the internet, right? As does IRC, as do these other systems that harken back to this idea of decentralization as a first principle, right? Or maybe what you might want to think of, I mean, DNS and other systems aren't completely decentralized. In some ways, they have kind of a minimum viable centralization, right? Have something that kind of coordinates as little as possible, with some governance structure like the domain name system as I can. But at the end of the day, try to deliver as many services at the edge and enable a kind of peer-to-peer connection rather than projecting the internet as this big centralized kind of thing, right? And probably like many of your listeners, I got a little despondent starting about 10 years ago when it seemed like the move to the cloud, and I'll try not to draw too many ironic connections with a sponsor, faster. But where the move to the cloud seemed to be about a move towards centralization, right? We use this metaphor of this ethereal kind of omnipresent thing, but it really was about some specific data centers and some specific locations and specific technologies and specific set of shareholders, right? And maybe you shared with me that kind of sense that, is this really the path that the internet should take? Is it the case that every industry essentially will converge on a central market provider for that industry? If we wanted to, will something like hailing a cab start centralized under one company, or booking a hotel room or that sort of thing? Is that kind of the nature of the internet that we've built, where it's so much easier, it seems, to build a central big database rather than decentralized federated networks, right? And what all of us have been a part of, say, the OpenID and OAuth kind of effort to try to decentralize identity, and discovered that really that just led to login with Facebook, login with Twitter. Right.
Right.
And so, I'm sure other people shared this. And so when the Bitcoin paper came out in 2008, I can't say I read the entire paper, but I read the abstract. It suggested that, there were equally people disturbed about this and thinking about, is there a way at a completely different level, at the level of payments and the level of moving money around and having stores of value, that we could have an alternative answer, right, to this. And it depended upon this underlying structure, which I think most people didn't realize. I mean, in some ways, this was like somebody showing up in the 1850s with a rocket ship to the moon, going to the moon, and saying, look, we got to the moon, here's some rocks, and coming home. And nobody realizing that the real innovation there from an economics perspective was the rocket ship. It wasn't getting to the moon. It was the fact that there was a way to get into outer space, get into orbit, that sort of thing. And that's what blockchain technology was. But like most other people, I didn't get it then, and went on to do obviously, you mentioned I have a background in open source software. I worked at the White House in 2009, 2010, worked for the World Economic Forum in 2011 and 12, and then back as a venture capitalist in San Francisco after that. And had increasingly seen, business plan after a pitch that was all about centralization. And then finally somebody showed up and said, and lots of Bitcoin companies, a few blockchain companies, but it was when I met a company called Factum, and they were starting to talk about land titles in emerging markets. And I was like, wait, what? And they said, yeah, using a distributed ledger, essentially a write-only database where changes to that can be audited, and where essentially every transaction is signed off by everybody else on the network, right? You can implement essentially a shared database with nobody at the center, but with enough crypto and enough integrity checking that everybody who's a participant on the network can know that something has been written, and no one can go back in time and change what has been written. No one can deny what has been written. And everything that has been written is there in a singular place, right? And the land title story is that, as various countries were digitizing land records and they were starting to put these into a database, it actually was harder to prevent the stealing of people's land, because it was suddenly so much easier to eliminate the paper trail that might have existed when somebody's home that they had in a record system was now suddenly sold off without their consent, without their agreement, to a land developer or to an oil company or to the politician's son or something, right? And so the premise was, very much like a version control system, right? For contracts, like something that we in the software community take for granted. Now that we have Git, that we have Subversion, where changes can be audited, changes to source code can be tracked, and validated and verified, right? This is something the rest of the world does not have, or did not have, until people really started talking about blockchain technology. So a blockchain is simply that. It's simply a decentralized, you could call it a database, but a ledger is a better way to think of it, because it's write-only. It's immediately confirmed by other participants on the network. And we've had distributed database technology for forever, right? But those have always been presumed on the idea that all of your nodes on the network were, working on your behalf, wanted to maintain the integrity. The novel thing about this data structure is that it can operate even if some portion of your nodes, sometimes it's 33%, sometimes it's up to 50%, are actually hostile and might want to, do the kind of thing that in some ways SMTP, which was abuse the network, right? And so after finding out more about this, I asked what I think is a lot of the same questions on people's mind when they first hear about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, which is, to get this kind of functionality, do you really need to use a cryptocurrency for it? Or can you fund this mechanism of these nodes coming to agreement about what the next transaction in the ledger is and guaranteeing that everybody has the same transaction? Can you do that without needing a currency? And the answer is yes. The answer is that there are proof of work is what we tie to cryptocurrency and mining and the fact that you can run a miner on your laptop and be generating Bitcoin. And it is the only thing that we know works at the scale of something the size of the internet and where the majority of your participants are anonymous. But if you have a community where the participants are not anonymous to each other, where they're known, and in fact, one where they sign an agreement to be a part of a network that might bind them to the kinds of things that you can't control in code, right? Things like it's a healthcare data sharing network where every participant agrees that they won't resell the data they discover about a patient beyond that network, right? Because that would be really bad. If you have participants who are not anonymous, you can use what are called Byzantine fault tolerant types of algorithms to decide amongst this population who wants to write the next transaction, who gets the right to perform the next transaction, and how do we lock that in and give everyone kind of ACID compliant, transactional guarantees about the integrity of that chain. You can also support much higher transaction rates. You can and a much lower fee if you want to think of, running the compute infrastructure as a fee, right? And we can get to a point where we're looking at use cases. I mean, this, as I dug into this, I realized if you think about how banking networks work, about how other types of information sharing networks work, transaction networks, all of them operate on this principle of there is a cluster, there's a community, and that border should be porous. It should be possible for new people to join all the time. But it operates very much on this principle. And in many cases, that central market actor is either charging too much or has too much power. And this is a way for participants in that ecosystem to kind of take control back and say, we're going to use technology tools to reduce the power of a central market actor and work together on a common system of record and a whole bunch of automation that can come from smart contracts on top of that. So I fell into this rabbit hole, and I'll just end with, it was in December of 2015, so about 18 months ago, the Linux Foundation announced the Hyperledger project. And so this was right about the time I was going down this rabbit hole. And to some degree, it kind of looked like, I'm 44 years old, so I get to say this. It looked like a 44-year-old showing up at a skateboard park with, a brand new skateboard they bought on Amazon and saying, hey, kids, hold my beer and watch this, But in reality, it was a set of companies ranging from IBM and JP Morgan and Intel to a bunch of new fintech startups to, a pretty broad set saying, let's investigate this path. Let's look at technologies that we could build around distributed ledgers and smart contracts that are more geared to the permissioned network, more geared towards the intrinsic value that organizations can get from running a common system of record, and let's get in there and get this technology deployed, and not as a alternative to cryptocurrencies, because it solves a very different problem. In fact, in some cases, these private networks will benefit from having these public ledgers that you can record checksums to as a way to help verify the integrity of the private ledger. And so I dove in and said, how can I be involved? And the Linux Foundation said, well, by the way, we're looking for somebody to lead this. So joined in May of last year. And since that time, we've grown Hyperledger to over 150 different organizations involved as sponsoring members, hundreds of different developers, 8 different software projects. We just hit 1.0 general availability of Fabric, which is kind of our flagship project. But a lot of interesting stuff going on around identity, around smart contract languages. It's a really vibrant kind of melting pot of a lot of different ideas. And it's been a lot of fun to help shepherd that forward.
Well, Brian, it's been great having you on. It's a great show.
That was a record
Yes.
12-minute answer. Congratulations, Brian.
I'm so sorry.
Your trophy will be in the mail.
Oh, you get me started, and I forget what the question is, and I feel like I have to answer all possible questions. No, I'm kidding.
It's awesome. I think you answered my next 6 questions, so I think we're probably already ahead of schedule here. So, but one thing immediately came to mind, though, and I hadn't actually seen it this way before, but the motivation for people to spend, compute power to move Bitcoin forward is that they can mine coins. But it sounds like the motivation to spend compute power to produce these public ledgers or private ledgers, depending on how it works out, is the fact that there's a common shared mutual interest. Is that an accurate representation?
Yeah. So what's your motivation for running an SMTP server?
To get mail.
It's so that you can send and receive mail, right?
Yeah.
Or setting up a website. Even if, again, many of us are kind of old guard, so we probably ran mail services for our friends. We probably ran web services for our friends. Some of us might have even set up Usenet servers, right? And Usenet, actually, there's most of that traffic you didn't read, right? Maybe even a fraction of a percent. But you would run a Usenet server and relay messages to other Usenet servers because collectively it built this really resilient, broad kind of network, right? And so in many of the cases we're looking at, you have banking networks, for example, where the cost of running a server is a rounding error to zero. Right. Something that could stand up and do a couple hundred transactions a second, maybe up to tens of thousands of transactions a second if we do our job right, won't be anything beyond the order of a couple of Amazon Web Server instances per participating organization. Right. And for that, you'd get the value of having a complete copy of the ledger. Now, there might be subsets of ledgers, too. Fabric has an ability to kind of take an entire community and say there's certain transactions I only want to share with a subset of that community. So I'll only get the integrity checks and the sign-offs from that subset, but at least I'll have that. And so for that, you'll get what is incalculable in terms of value to these organizations. And in the case of a banking network, where in something like SWIFT, it takes 3 days to confirm the transfer of a wire from one bank to another, because of the old batch-oriented process for reconciling these kind of processes after the fact. Instead, move to a system like this. You get a confirmation of that transaction inside of a few minutes, and people don't have to wait for their money to flow. And so the value of that is incalculable, right? It does mean that it moves us. It's not an answer to the question of, I want to build a transaction network where everybody can participate with their laptop. I would argue that Bitcoin moved away from that long ago. It's no longer economically viable for many of us to run Bitcoin mining nodes on our laptops, because the amount of Bitcoin we earn from that is dwarfed by the amount that we spend on the electricity to generate, any reasonable amount of that. Right now, that control is in the hands of the mining pools. And so, the real question for permission networks is, how do you discover them? How do you get permissioned onto them? And can we make some of them public? Could we reinvent how DNS works as a public network? That sort of thing. So it's taking a much broader view of this than how do I mine Bitcoins on my laptop.
Right. So I took a look at the Hyperledger project, Brian, and you've been around, a year? And you've already got something absolutely enormous there. You've got a staff of 12 people who look like they're all powerful corporate executive types. You've got 8 projects already. How has it got so big so fast?
So part of the key for that is being part of the Linux Foundation, right? The Linux Foundation is as many of you know, 15-year-old organization that has been at the heart of the Linux ecosystem, and now increasingly other adjacent technology spaces, software-defined networking, cloud computing. And the model that they kind of set up was, pull the developers together to give them a governance organization so that you can answer the question, how do we know that this project will live on beyond its original developers, beyond its original sponsors, et cetera, but also then involve the corporations who are building products and services in this space, or otherwise just have an intrinsic need for this technology to exist, and get them to pony up to do all the kinds of things that either open source developers tend not to want to do, or where you really do have some value from paying a staff to handle, right? Everything from the legal services front to PR and marketing to setting up telephone calls and hosting of events, right? Linux Foundation also does training and certification and some other things, but we plugged into a really good template, right? And the project, I mean, when I joined, we had 35 members, and we've grown that since. But I've been able to grow that because of the leverage the Linux Foundation already has inside of so many of these organizations. But about half of our members are new. When they come in, they aren't already members of the Linux community. They don't even think of themselves as open source companies. JP Morgan was not a member of any open source project before we engaged with them. Their individual developers might have been contributing, but they did not have the kind of internal IP processes and others that I think they have today, partly because of realizing that now in financial services, they need to get smarter about how this works. So my staff, none of them are core software developers. I have a few that are full-time. Most of the names on my staff list are people that I share with other projects at the Linux Foundation. But a couple of them are core to what we do. Two that I'll highlight in particular. One is the role of security maven. This is kind of, think of it like a CISO. This is somebody whose job is to make sure that the everything we do has security at its forefront, right? That we're doing things like having a relationship with CERT, so that if security holes are found, we can respond quickly. To organizing the security team amongst all of our different projects. To looking at bug bounty programs, that sort of thing, and making sure what we build has enough kind of credibility from a security perspective that it all makes sense. The other role I'll highlight is community architect. This is not community manager, which is typically more of a PR kind of function or a marketing kind of function. This is more a technologist who is expected, and Tracy Kurt, who is this for us, she does this very well, to dive into the code, dive into the communities, watch how the code is being built, and look for the kinds of behavior patterns that we know are anti-patterns when it comes to successful open source development, right? Whether it's software development activities being done offline with the results being brought online rather than presenting it as an open conversation, or if it's a tooling problem. The way I framed it is anything that's a barrier to collaboration is her job to try to bring down, right? So that new devs can come in and become core maintainers based entirely upon their talent, their communication skills, and the time that they can commit to it. So all of that requires a staff, and that's why we have just a tremendously talented set of individuals working at. All of us are Linux Foundation employees, but we are focused on making this community everything it can be.
Right. And then the code projects, I took a look through them. It looks like they were already pre-existing projects that have been donated by members. So the one you've recently released, Fabric, appears to have been donated by IBM. You've got Sawtooth, which is your platform, which appears to have been donated by Intel. So is that going to be the way that you're going to be going forward, is to adopt projects from members, or do you think you're going to be doing original coding within the community?
Well, I think this is true for every one of the kind of open source organizations out there, that they start life as a pre-existing code base at some level of maturity. They might be a weekend hack, but I can't think of an Apache project, for example, that might have started just with an idea that didn't actually have code associated with it, right? So every one of these projects did likely have code. In fact, everyone did have code before coming to Hyperledger. That's simply how these kinds of things work. The entry into Hyperledger, though, is really just the beginning of the life cycle, right? When they come in, first there's a proposal, just like at Apache, a proposal that gets reviewed. In this case, it's by the Technical Steering Committee, which is elected by all the contributors to the project once a year. In fact, we have an election coming up, and then they look at is this an interesting project? Is it related to the mission of the organization? Are there enough other developers showing up that it's likely to become a multi-vendor project? Or is it just, what we don't want are projects that are cast-offs, that are failed experiments, or products that need to be end-of-lifed. What we want are something that complements the existing portfolio, even if it overlaps to some degree. And one thing that people notice and criticize us on is that there is a fair degree of overlap between the projects. And that's because we feel there are different ideas, different approaches to building these systems, and we want a melting pot. We want to bring them together, allow them to grow, but nudge these projects to look at each other and figure out how to eventually build on top of each other and be additive to each other. And so that requires a bit more kind of curation, I guess you would say, than you might see typically at other open source nonprofits.
Right. Now, I'm interested you have a technical steering committee because in all other respects, Hyperledger looks like you as one of the founders of Apache are doing Apache again at Linux Foundation. You know, all the code's under the Apache license. Everything is developer driven in terms of the code. And yet you have this technical steering committee. Do you think that this is an improvement on Apache's model, or would you think this is more an application for a different problem space?
So there are some big differences here, and certainly a lot of this is informed by my experience with Apache, and I'm still a member there. I haven't been on the board in a while, but I watch, and there's a lot to admire about how Apache works. But I also am on the board of the Mozilla Foundation, so I've seen that close up. I've seen some other nonprofits close up, like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and there's a lot of different ideas out there about how to run an open source community or an open source community of communities, right? And I think the Linux Foundation figured out something pretty valuable here, which was how to involve the commercial ecosystem without letting that dominate, right? And without letting that overrule or lead to bad code or lead to conflict, and grow kind of more at an infrastructure layer, kind of interesting stuff, and be very curated about it as well. So we have this framing for Hyperledger, which is distributed ledgers and smart contracts. Call it blockchain, if you will. That term kind of means less for me now with every passing day. But we have this framing and also for permission ledgers for enterprises, for business. Think of it that way, right? Given that framing, what's the best way to organize the interested talent, the interested pre-existing projects out there, and pull those together and into a meaningful thing, such that when people land at the site, they have a way to try to figure out how to get started, and that really every available hour, whether from a core developer or a newbie, is turned into something valuable for that person, right? So for that, the model there is to some degree have a bit more of a funded staff at the center than Apache typically has had. Not quite so many as, say, Mozilla has had. Mozilla, because of the space it operates in, building consumer software, it would be really hard for them to build that and depend entirely upon a community to emerge to do the core development. Hard to do that and keep up with the pace of things like the other browsers out there, right? For this, we are pretty committed, just as Apache is, to never paying somebody for a line of code, right? Our belief is you can't, if you start to hire developers and have them work on the core projects directly, then you create this dichotomy between who's paid and who's not paid, and does the person who's paid, does their opinion matter more, or does their code matter more than somebody who doesn't? And how do you remain honest to what people actually need versus what Brian thinks needs to be built, right? So we depend upon people to show up and companies to show up and do the work of building these different infrastructures as a core way to validate the need for this technology in the first place, right? Our job is to facilitate, enable, clear the deck of all the things developers don't actually want to do, and I think that's a model that works.
Right. So now we're a long way into the hour now, and I haven't talked about the code at all yet. Do you want to tell us where is the end of this big ball of thread that is the Hyperledger project? Which project would you go to if you were one of FLOSS Weekly's viewers and listeners and wanting to look at it for the first time?
So Fabric is the one that's probably most mature at this point from a platform perspective, right? If you wanted to pull together a set of, let me just say, within an hour of sitting down with the code, you should be able to have a 4-node instance running inside of a set of Docker VMs on your laptop and be ready to deploy your first smart contract code, the equivalent of Hello World, right? There's a bit of a learning curve in terms of what it means to actually be working with distributed ledger technology, and the fact that there is no such thing as a blockchain of one, right? Almost every interesting use case is going to involve coordinating with other parties, potentially even competitors, to build a network, build a transaction network. So presuming you've climbed that learning curve, the actual code learning curve is to get to a point of productivity is pretty as easy as we can make it right now, and it's getting easier all the time. Composer is a project that's intended to broaden it even further by essentially introducing an IDE for authoring of these blockchain networks, kind of like what Eclipse was to the Java community. So developers may decide to start there. It's a little less mature. It hasn't hit its 1.0 yet, but it has a very active team behind it. And I'd say for developers who are really interested in the Ethereum technology stack, we have a project called Burrow, which is an implementation of the Ethereum virtual machine. So you can take your Solidity code, Solidity contract, and deploy them onto a private network using Burrow all by itself. And we're hoping to get that smart contract grafted onto Fabric at some point down the road. Finally, I'll note, if you're interested in identity networks, using this for, think about what we did OAuth and OpenID for, but now at the scale of national identities or simply very large communities. Hyperledger Indy is worth tracking and getting to know more about. It's part of a broader collaborative between us and a couple of other organizations to try to figure out how to use blockchain technology for decentralized identity in a way that implements this vision called self-sovereign identity, where rather than you being an entry in a database, there is there's basically an overlay chain that contains pointers between your identities on multiple different chains with a wallet interface that allows you to decide when to share personal data between these chains. Lots more to talk about, lots more behind that, but it's a way that we hope we can start to answer people's concerns about the use of blockchain technology for systems where there's going to be a lot of personally identifiable information.
So I just saw in your press releases that Fabric hit 1.0. I think it's only as recently as last week. What significance does that have to what you're doing?
It's really just a signpost, right? It's intended to say, okay, the developer community around Fabric. This is actually, Fabric was that and Sawtooth were the first two code bases that were released in February of last year. Fabric is the committed tool of a number of different companies, including IBM, who have been going out and selling, blockchain technology conceptually, but then also saying, let's get started with proofs of concept, with pilots. There's even been some production instances now that have moved to Fabric. And so between the last major release, which was 0.6, about 9 months ago, and 1.0, there's been a tremendous amount of work in saying, how do we get the basics right? How do we have a simple, crash-tolerant, if not Byzantine, that's coming soon, network for distributed ledgers and smart contracts, and provide the basics so that people can start to stand up real systems, run them in production, and use them and trust them for digital assets, right? That this is intended to be something that you can trust, you can depend upon. And so that meant hitting that point in the roadmap where they said, okay, we have the right type of architecture, the right kind of scaling, and let's now let it settle for a couple of months. Let us squeeze issues out. Let's make the maintainability of the code high, the readability of it, work on some docs, and get it out there so that the next order of magnitude of users, and hopefully that means developers, can start to come to the project. That meant holding off on a lot of important work that now the maintainers on Fabric are eager to get started on. So we'll probably get back into the mode of new releases and new feature work happening pretty soon. This is not intended to be a long-term support release, so we're still expecting people to be upgrading. If they come to us with a bug in 1.0.0 and we've released 1.0.2, we're going to ask them to upgrade and reproduce, right? So there's that wisdom that says if you're not embarrassed by your 1.0 release a year after releasing it, then you probably waited too long to release it. So setting everyone's expectations appropriately, we still feel like this is an inflection point, right? And if folks had been holding off, which many had, for a 1.0 release before moving from a proof of concept to a pilot or moving from a pilot to production, now they can put that behind them and get started.
Well, then, speaking of production, are people really using this yet?
So my favorite example, it's one that maybe your listeners have heard me give before, but my favorite one is the diamond supply chain. So in the diamond world, there is a provenance tracking system for diamonds as they move through a chain that had been set up about 20 years ago to keep conflict diamonds, diamonds from mines that abuse human rights or the diamonds that have been used to buy or sell weapons or like other illicit purposes, to try to keep those out of the supply chain so they don't end up, on a ring at Macy's, right? And this process had been a centralized, bureaucratic, not very transparent kind of system. It's being reinvented as a distributed ledger. Hyperledger, using Hyperledger. There's a company actually called Everledger that's behind that, and they are in shadow chain mode, where they are shadowing the data flow coming in sometime this year. They hope to move to production where each of the participants in the diamond trade will run their own node on this distributed ledger and be publishing transactions to it, so that hopefully at some point you'll be able to show up at Macy's, do a scan of the ID on the diamond, and come up with a fairly credible history as to where it came from. Right, but there are about a half dozen other production deployments, which is pretty good for something that when you think about how sensitive this is and how mission critical this can be, is pretty good to hear. But there are hundreds of other proofs of concept and pilots out there. We have a proof of concept tracker, a POC tracker on the website, where we try to keep track of this. Sadly, we don't have a means as easy as the Apache web server had to see who out there is running it. It was a big ego boost in '98 when Netcraft was able to tell us that both the Vatican and the CIA were running Apache as a web server, right? That made us feel pretty good. Nothing quite so easy there, but from the volume of contributions coming in and questions being of companies joining as participants and telling us about work that they're doing. People are very sensitive about kind of where they're using it, right? We're trying to find more systematic ways to gather that data, but it's easily into the hundreds of different late stage pilots right now. Places too. I mean, Walmart will be using this to track the supply chain of meat products in China as a way to detect and trace foodborne illness and corrupt product more quickly. There are Northern Trust is using this in a financial chain. Swift and DTCC are running pilots on this now for their networks. So CLS Bank, which handles all the transactions between the sovereign banks of the world and processes instruments in value of $5 trillion per day, will be using this for their settlement netting system. So there are real institutions committing to this, and it's kind of humbling, right? And sadly, as an open source project, we won't know details about most of them, right? But it's been very cool to see the pickup out there.
And so a couple things about blockchain technology. One of the things that sort of is crumbling under its own success is the fact that it now takes over an hour to really verify a Bitcoin transaction. Won't all the rest of these networks eventually have so much data in them that they'll take terabytes worth of data in a single block and therefore eventually crumble the same way?
Not quite the same. I mean, this is a key distinction between permission ledgers and the public ledgers, right? The public ledgers were designed, at least Bitcoin was designed. Ethereum is a little more flexible on this, but Bitcoin was designed to support 7 transactions per second. That's locked in to the architecture, and so as it gets more popular, that means that they've had to think about either low-level re-architecting, that's some of the big debates you see in the Bitcoin community now, or implementing transactions on a side chain, which is interesting, but takes away from some of the, kind of the benefit of running this as a public ledger in the first place, right? But that's part and parcel, I think, of running a public ledger. It's probably why you won't necessarily see, I don't think you'll see a public ledger used to trace all transactions worldwide at any point, because that would have to support millions to tens of millions of transactions a second to keep track of every payment happening in every store, every online purchase, that sort of thing. What you'll see, I think, really is this universe of different ledgers, right, maintained by different communities, business communities, designed in different ways to meet their use cases. Some of those networks will need high transaction rates because they'll need high atomicity of the transactions. They'll want to guarantee prevention of double spend, for example, and so that means every new transaction has to validate the others. Others will simply be more about recording events, and so there you don't need to prevent double spend. There, the transaction rates can be high, but with you could actually batch these things together in interesting ways. And then some networks that will be very close geographically. A lot of these algorithms are very sensitive to latency, much more than any other piece of data. So if you're trying to forge consensus around a set of nodes that are all on the same Ethernet LAN, that's going to be really fast, but not very realistic if your whole goal is to divide out the trust model So you're not dependent upon a central actor, a central network, even a single hosting provider, right? At the same time, if you try to forge nodes that are geographically distributed and there's 100 of them coming to consensus, we don't quite yet know how to do that at tremendously high volumes, right? So this is going to continue to be an active field of computer science research around consensus mechanisms, high volume, high number of nodes. There's some really interesting approaches that are being played with out there, and I really hope that Hyperledger can be a foundation for exploring those new consensus mechanisms. But there's a lot still to be determined. And what this means is that there will be this universe of different networks out there, and directories to find them, and ways to join them, and that sort of thing. But it's a complex world, but that's the way that the world looks right now, anyways. So.
Okay, and also, if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I've probably got a 50-50 chance on this one, but isn't public key crypto essential to this, so I can prove who I am when I'm submitting blocks?
Yes, that'll continue to be true. I mean, public key crypto is probably one of the best, computer science inventions ever, right? I mean, maybe we'll hold up the von Neumann architecture as a close second, but yeah, that is still central. And there's lots of people worried about the advent of quantum computers as a way to factor large primes, which I'm really happy to see the crypto community getting ahead of, try to figure out quantum resistant crypto architectures. But public key crypto and strong hashing, strong message digest, strong signature checking, that sort of thing, those are all core. The various political movements out there to ban crypto or ban the use of this, it'll end up meaning banning e-commerce. If these countries decide they want to opt out of that system, that's up to them. But I'm heartened by the fact that you can't build these systems without the kinds of end-to-end crypto and the kind of technologies that also incidentally help to protect privacy and verifiability online.
That's interesting. Then, if this kind of thing becomes commonplace in e-commerce, then any legislature anywhere or any crazy dictator might that says, well, we got to have backdoors to crypto, we got to ban all our crypto or both. They're gonna cut themselves off of e-commerce.
I mean, that's kind of true even regardless, right? With so much of the web now being encrypted, over 50% of web traffic now goes over TLS, right? You could mandate the use of weak keys, perhaps, but I don't want to give dictators too many ideas here. Yeah, at the end of the day, this is math. And this is the genie has left the bottle on this, regardless. But all of this is core to how these technologies work.
And another thing I was interested in, when you were talking about the land registry earlier, I was thinking that it was interesting that is sort of democratizes the public ownership of land in the same way that open source democratized the software industry. Is that a fair comparison?
It could. I mean, the first pilots that you'll see in this space will still have the government as the issuer of updates to that registry, right? You'll still file your paperwork with the land title office, and they will publish it out. And the participants on that network, there may be a public side of that network, but there might also be more data shared on kind of a private kind of sharing network with the types of organizations involved in that industry. Just like today, I mean, you can't download from any county office, title office, who owns what property, because that's considered kind of even a privacy issue. But you could see on that chain the different parties involved in real estate, whether it's realtors and lenders, financial organizations, and others who are a part of guaranteeing the integrity of that chain. I think the second phase is one where on that chain, you start to introduce roles and abilities for other participants to record transactions. For a mortgage lender, for example, to be able to record a mortgage against a piece of property. And again, in a way that allows the owner of that property to validate, verify that, et cetera, that starts to broaden that out. And so not everybody has to go through the central government office to get that recorded into the title chain, right? The third stage of that might be to the point where even the landholders and the citizens hold private keys that tie to their ownership of a given piece of property or a lease on a property or some other agreement. And then when they want to transfer their title to that property to somebody else, they simply sign a digital transaction themselves. And at that point, the government has no role except as observer, right? Maybe arbitrating disputes, maybe serving as a witness in a court battle if one ever emerges. But this could be about transforming things that today we depend upon government to do for us and can start to do ourselves. And this isn't a, to the barricades kind of like down with central government, down with, it's not that kind of revolution. It's more find ways to reduce the need for government gradually and with the integrity that people expect and why they have government perform these roles in the first place. Maybe that can extend to the way that financial markets are regulated, to the way that certain other industries are regulated. If we can make it impossible through these technologies to perform the kinds of fraud that we're worried about, or to at least make it transparent and evident when that kind of fraud is happening, then maybe we can get to a point where everybody runs more efficiently, including government.
So it's very interesting to hear all that discussion, because I've read a book by an economist called Hernando de Soto. It's called The Mystery of Capital, where he explains that land registries are the anchor for capitalism. And from what you're talking about there, Brian, sounds like it is taking that anchor for capitalism that we historically put in the hands of central government, and in a libertarian dream, placing that anchor for property ownership into the hands of the people. Is that any part of your motivation in all this?
I don't identify myself as a libertarian entirely. I believe in a strong safety net. I mean, we can talk politics here if you want. I'm not sure that makes sense. But having spent 2 years in D.C., so I worked, for government. You get an upfront view, and I consider myself more of a progressive, maybe Democrat, if you want to call it that. Although it's much more nuanced than that. But anybody who works in government kind of comes to the realization that if you can make government more effective, so any dollar that it spends, any hour of a bureaucrat's time, anything that it has to do to ensure the functioning of society can be made more efficient, can be made more accountable, made more transparent, but recognize that people have privacy interests too. So transparency has to be balanced with privacy. But if you can optimize that, I mean, that's a nonpartisan issue, right? We should cut the cost of government, not by cutting services, but by making everyone more efficient, right? That's a nonpartisan issue. And I think there's real potential for blockchain tech to do that. Again, I don't align myself with folks who say that this technology renders moot the need for government, renders moot the need for law enforcement. It doesn't do anything of the sort. It has to exist in that ecosystem, or you'll find yourself banned from those networks, and moving money in and out of those networks. But it does, I think, offers a chance to reinvent how a lot of government services are delivered, and that touch point between government, citizens, and businesses.
Right. I've heard a lot of people talking that way about how blockchain is the ultimate dismissal of government. But I'm with you there. So really, this is the fulfillment of your experiences in the Obama White House and the World Economic Forum. This is going and doing something practical about the meltdown that we've now got in world politics by putting aside all the politics and getting on with technology.
I think this is the highest value thing I can be doing at the moment. Whether this is the peak of my career, I'll leave that to historians to judge. But yeah, I think this is one of the better ways I can be venting my frustration with the current situation in DC.
Right.
Okay, so hey, we're almost out of time. We're right up against the wire here, but is there anything we haven't covered yet that you want to make sure our audience is aware of about maybe blockchains in general or Hyperledger in particular?
It can feel a little bewildering at first. I so totally understand. What we've really tried to do on the Hyperledger website is put together not just here's how to get involved, here's how to start using the code, here's some sample code, here's some tutorials, and obviously all of the development processes are public. That's one thing we really have inherited from the Apache community, is the sense that the integrity of everything comes from development happening in the public, development happening in a consistent way, not just the code being public. So please come in, join, be observers, be lurkers. We love that. That's not a problem at all. And hopefully, we can put forward some content that you can read that helps understand where you might think about applying this to business problems in your industry. If you have had a CEO or CIO bear down on you and say, "What's our blockchain strategy? What are we doing in this space?" Hopefully, we can arm you with some thinking, some ideas on where that makes sense. But this is very much like 1995 in the web, maybe 96 now that Fabric 1.0 is shipped. But we're still figuring out what to do with this tech. So it's not too early to start getting your hands dirty with it. Not too early to start building a little POC. One of my favorite things to do is build games out of this. Like take a board game like Monopoly, or something multiplayer, something where there's shared state, something where nobody trusts each other because you're all competitors, and build an app building that game using Fabric, using Sawtooth, using the different technologies underneath, and through that, I bet you'll start to discover there's a universe of other things you can be doing.
That sounds awesome. Do you get to do any coding, or are you in full manager mode now?
Geek diplomat. I stay close enough to the code and to the teams to understand what's going on, so I can speak credibly and call BS when I need to, and be that annoying interloper nobody really likes. But no, I think the world is much better off without me writing code at this point, serious amounts of code at least. I leave that to people much better at that than I am. But I still hold the developers as really the ones driving this community, right? It has to be about what they feel is the right thing to build, the right way to build it. And I'm there to support them. All of us at the Linux Foundation are there to support the developer communities first, and depend upon them to set the direction and vision overall for the project.
Well, since this is a geek show, I have two required questions I have to ask you. One, what is your favorite scripting language?
You're going to love this. It's probably still Perl.
Yay! Yay! Finally a winner! Finally! No more Python people. Only Perl.
It's really dating me, but all of Wired Magazine's initial website, the first web ad banner, all of that depended heavily upon Perl. So thank you to the Perl community, right, for helping me get everything launched. And so, yeah, it's still that. And I know I need to massively update that because I know there's not only new stuff in Perl, but new languages out there. So, it's a fun world now.
Perl has changed so much over the years that I almost don't recognize some of the latest releases. I mean, at one point, I knew everything there was to know about Perl, but that was about 15 years ago, and I'm not even keeping up with it. So I'm kind of embarrassed being the #1 Perl author in the world and yet not knowing what's currently happening in the Perl community. So I'm a little annoyed by that. But I've got to ask you the other question. I bet the other one's actually going to make me happy too. What's your favorite text editor?
Favorite text editor, sadly, is Emacs.
Yay! 2 out of 2! I can't believe it. We are bonded. We are kindred. We are kindred. That is awesome. But I knew, given the era that you came up in, those were probably the likely things anyway. So that's why I had to ask both of those. So, Brian, hey, it's been wonderful having you on. I think this is going to go down as one of our landmark shows where we're really going to look back at it as an example of what we're trying to do with FLOSS Weekly and get things out to the community and get the community back up at us. So I really appreciate you coming on and taking the time to talk about Hyperledger and about what it's good for and where it's going. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. You all are my peeps. So this is really great.
Awesome. Brian Behlendorf, representing the Hyperledger project. What do you think there, Simon?
Oh, it's all good stuff, I think. I remember seeing when Bitcoin first happened, I thought back then that blockchain and a distributed ledger was the technology answer to so many problems in the world, and it's as if the gold, the glint of the gold, masked everyone's vision of it. All people could see was the cryptocurrency and the get rich quick of the inflation of the cryptocurrency. That people overlooked the blockchain and all the problems that it solved. And I see that Hyperledger, by taking the coin out of the crypto, it's making blockchain something that people will respect and use to solve problems in a decentralized way and bring the original promise of the internet back into computing. So I think this is one of the critical, most important projects in computing today, making sure that blockchain can be standardized and used globally without needing to be blinded by Bitcoin and cryptocurrency the whole time.
Yeah, and I like the way Brian put it, that that we're sort of at the same place with this sort of idea of decentralized but authoritative communications is sort of at the same place that would happen in '96 with the interactive web enabling e-commerce in the first place, thanks to Perl. But that's a whole other story. but I like that that analogy is there, and I mean here we are 30 years later almost, right? So it's it's time for a new revolution, I guess. So anything else before I run down the upcoming guests?
No, I'm really looking forward to seeing democratization projects come out of this. At the moment, Hyperledger is the domain of big corporates. It's all being seeded by IBM and by Intel and by players who typically come to these projects to stop anything bad happening. They typically join in to stop somebody else taking a monopolistic technology lead over a market segment. And I'm looking forward to beginning to see the first real citizen projects come out of here, things that don't involve a big corporate as the prime actor. And I think this is exactly the technology that can take those things forward, because we're way overdue for the re-decentralization of the internet.
Absolutely. Well put, Simon. Thank you. Well, here's what's coming up. Next week, we have the creator of Jenkins. Sorry, I don't have his name right here, but that's the leading continuous integration, continuous deployment server. It was a hostile fork of Hudson, which I'm sure Simon is familiar with. Also, Containership, which is a cross-platform deploying and managing containers. We're going to talk about the conference allthingsopen.org. It's been running on for 5 years, and I didn't know anything about it until a few months ago. And I'm actually going, and we're going to have a couple of people from the staff of that come on and talk about the show long before it happens, so you can actually buy tickets still. LibreOffice, we're updating them after having not been on the show for 5 years. Also an update for Kazoo, which is cloud telephony. We're going to have a very special co-host for that show, I hope. He says he's still on for it, so somebody you haven't heard in a long time in this show, but he was on the previous 2 shows for Kazoo, so we're going to bring him on again. It'll be really nice, sir. The Hiawatha web server is a security-focused web server. Aquameta, which is a web dev environment designed around datafication, which I still don't understand, but that's on their website, using Postgres, which is weird. Just added to the schedule, we have friendup.cloud, which is promising a desktop OS in a browser tab, and a bunch of other related technologies around that. I think that's been done 3 or 4 times, but I think they're taking a new approach to it from what they tell me. And then rounding up the currently booked list is Crail, which is a high-performance storage networking system. You can see all those and more at twit.tv/floss. You go there, that's the homepage for this show, and from there is linked to the Who's Our Upcoming Guests links. If you have a project that wants to be on our show that isn't on that list already, which means I'm not already talking to them probably, unless I just haven't updated the spreadsheet, please have them email me, merlin@stonehenge.com. My address is right there on that webpage as well. And have the project coordinator or the community coordinator, project leader actually, or community coordinator email me. We have a live stream at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time on Wednesdays at live.twit.tv. We can watch all the mistakes we make behind the scenes, and also talk to us via the chat room, and we take questions from time to time from there. You can follow us at Floss Weekly on Google+, which also tweets over to @FlossWeekly on Twitter. You can follow me at Randal L. Schwartz on Google+, and that tweets over to Merlin, MERLYN. I will be in Dragon Con in about 4 weeks, I think it is now. Yeah, it's getting close. Yeah, 6 weeks, maybe 5 weeks. And I'll actually be doing my 1-hour Why Dart Should Be Your Next Programming Language talk there. I'm rapidly trying to finish it up and create it up. I'll also be just got invited to the Open Source Summit in Los Angeles. That's like the second week in September. Again, another conference, actually, I think, run by the Linux Foundation. And they've invited me to come along and hunt down more Floss Weekly guests, which is always a fun thing for me to do. And it's right here in LA, so I'm real familiar with the area. I also will be at the allthingsopen.org conference, which is, in fact, over, I think, in the Research Triangle. And I'll actually be going back to Cuba in January, which has nothing to do with anything with Floss Weekly, but it will mean that I'm away from here for a week, and I'm on Cuba, this time on a cruise ship instead of just going in a plane. So it should be pretty fun. Simon, any plugs you want to make here?
I have to say that I'm looking forward to hearing what it's Kosuke that's the originator of Hudson and Jenkins. I'm looking forward to hearing what he's got to say. I really like the business model that CloudBees has put around Jenkins, and I hope that you're going to talk about that next week.
Absolutely.
You mentioned LibreOffice is coming up on the show in in August rather. Next time I'm out in public is probably going to be the LibreOffice conference in Paris. If you live in Europe, you really do want to join us at the LibreOffice conference in Rome, not in Paris. LibreOffice conference in Rome. It's a completely free conference. It's got a lot of great people going to it. We're holding the conference in the Roman Capitol building on the Capitoline Hill. So you'll get to go to meetings in the heart of the Roman Empire. It's going to be an absolutely classic conference, and I would really love to see a lot of Floss Weekly viewers and listeners there. That's going to be on the 11th and 12th of October. So do please come along to that. I'm also going to be at the Capano conference in the Netherlands on the 27th and 28th, where I'm giving one of the keynote speeches. And who knows what happens after that? Maybe I'll go to some other conferences. Who knows? I've changed the URL down there on my bottom third for those of you who are viewing. It's now got my company's website, meshedinsights.com, and I'm posting pretty much every week an article there that is drawn from the open source community and gives insight into the goings-on behind the scenes. So this week's article covers the current debacle between the Apache Software Foundation and Facebook over the licensing for React.js and RocksDB. And if you use any of those technologies, you'll want to go to meshedinsights.com and take a look at that. And do please follow on that website if you want to get the sort of weird stuff that I talk about on Floss Weekly as background. That shows up on that website every week. I think that's everything I want to plug. Randall, back to you.
Well, I'll definitely check that out, too. I'll add that to my list. I hope it's got an RSS feed, because that's the only way I read things anymore these days. But yes, I'm still old school RSS feeds, but that's the only way to keep track of all the news. What? Yeah, I'm the one. I'm the one.
You're the one still using it. Okay.
Yeah,
I wondered who was hitting my feed the whole time. It's you.
It's me. It's always me. Yes, it's definitely cool. Well, RSS is technology behind podcasting too. So, everybody that's subscribed to this show is using RSS behind the scenes. But anyway, that's diversion, and we're out of time. So, Simon, thank you once again for your wonderful insights and joining us again on the show here. I really appreciate it.
It's my great pleasure to show up again, and I look forward to doing some more of them in the coming months.
Absolutely. I will always invite you to every single show, and just sometimes you can make it, sometimes you can't. That's how this show rolls. But we're going to roll on, because we'll see you all again next week on Floss Weekly.